Today's show is made possible because of viewers like you. My name is Nick Durant, and today I'm going to show you how to do some accessories on your tattoo machine. I woke up this morning and I just felt like messing with this tattoo machine, which I don't even use this tattoo machine as much as I do other tattoo machines, but for some reason I'm always tweaking on this thing and messing with it, trying to make it look better and making improvements to it. So one of the things that really irritated me about this machine is this little wing nut screw, and every time I try to tighten this up, this side seems to loosen up a little bit. So whenever I have to get my tube in there, I have to hold this side, tighten this side, and then my tube moves on me, and it's a real pain in the butt. So trying to come up with a new way to do this. So first of all, getting rid of this little wing nut. I got nice pudgy fingers, and trying to turn this little tiny wing nut is no good. So getting rid of that. Now if you unscrew this, I'm going to show you something here. This side of the machine, this side of the frame, the tube vise or clamp, has threads in it. You can see it won't go in unless I turn this. But this side of the machine frame has no threads. You can see I can just slip this in and out of here. And that makes it possible to tighten up this side of the vise. But what happens is this screw stays in place. Tighten that down, and then this screw tightens down and will actually bend this. You'll see this opening will close as I turn this to tighten it up, and that will hold the tube. And again, this little tiny wing nut's a pain. So the first thing I did today, which I was just gonna do this on my own, but I decided if I'm gonna do this, why not show it on video. So this is, I went looking through my parts drawer and found this. I was originally looking for something to solder onto this, but this came across my path, and what this is a handle for a drawer or a cabinet. You put it on there and you would use this to pull the drawer or cabinet out. And I was lucky enough that it happened to be the same size as this screw. And you can see there's a lot to hold on here, nice and easy to turn. I can tighten that down, no problems. So I'm going to add that to the machine. Now I might cut this shorter just so this doesn't stick out so far, but I got to make sure there's enough thread in there for this to hold on to. But either way, I don't mind it like this. It'd just be preference, or just to make things a little more compact if I decide to cut this and shorten it up, which I think I'm going to do anyways. Okay, so you could probably go to the hardware store and find a smaller one of these, but I think for this machine it looks okay on there with the look of the machine. You might be able to find a knob that maybe fits better, but I have this one laying around, so I'm going to use this one. So you can see my thread only sticks out about that far, so I really only need that much. So I'm going to cut off about a 1/4 inch of this right here, just so it's not sticking out as far. So I shortened that up. I had to tweak it a little bit just to show you guys that I'm doing this at home in my garage, but the tools I'm using are really easy to get your hands on if you decide to do this kind of stuff. I'm using a Dremel tool. I use the Dremel tool to cut the knob, and then I used a file to clean up the edges when I was done. So I just came in with the file, made this nice and smooth. There you go. And so now I have this, and it's shorter, so it won't get in the way as much, and I can use this to tighten down my tube vise. And I think it adds a little look to the machine here. The next thing I needed, these coils are actually really good coils. This is a steel frame machine, and the coils are steel. They have enough pull to, you can have your armature bar set up here and it'll still pull them down. So these are pretty good coils. I had a 18 gauge real thin front spring on this machine, but I'm testing out different machine setups. So this is a 16 gauge spring that I made this morning. I just cut this out into a spring, and let me show you the tools I use for that. Another easy tool to get your hands on is some tin snips, and if you cut this back part out, you don't need the hole punch, or if you have a Dremel tool you can use that instead of a hole punch. But for about 20 bucks or so you can buy a hole punch, which will come in handy. So I would recommend, if you're making springs, just go ahead and buy the hole punch, because if you don't have one, you can use your Dremel tool, and you just have to come in here and eat away this area here with a Dremel tool. But with the hole punch, you can just punch the hole in that and then come back and snip this back part off, or leave it like that if you want it. But in order to adjust it, you want to leave the back part open so you can move it forward and back. So I made a couple of those. Here's the other one, all 16 gauge. I made this one a little longer. Not going to use it on this one, but going to try it out on a different machine. So removing the 18 gauge spring, and I put a 16 gauge, and you can see it's a little rough back here. This screw stuck out the bottom of my armature bar. I used to have this nut on here to keep it from doing that, but I wanted less weight on the armature bar. So all I did was I took this to my grinder and just made sure that was flat. Now some screws are shorter, and they don't go to the bottom of your armature bar. But I like to have the bottom of my armature bar solid, so I just put it in there and ground it down so that it was flat. Now, the metals on your armature bar and your machine, they like to collect junk. You don't have to use a file. A file might be a little more abrasive than what you want, but I already hit this with a grinder, so I'm going to file this down a little bit, just back here where it's rough, just to make that smooth. And then I'm going to take a sandpaper and clean this off real good. Make sure there's no residue and junk in here. Now you can see, kind of, hopefully you can see this. See this circle on the armature bar? If you use the same armature bar on your machine long enough, and it hits this front coil long enough, you start to get an indentation in your armature bar. It's like memory foam, kind of, you know, that's your memory because it'll hit there and it's used to hitting there. So if you move this, it's going to hit another spot and start making that indentation in another spot. So if you want to make sure it goes back in the same spot all the time, you have to mark your springs and mark your machine so you know where to put it back at. But I'm not worried about that. I'm just going to clean this off, sand this down, and then put my armature bar back on here. And all these little screws that came with it are steel, so we get a little bit of rust on here. So while I have it apart and I'm putting everything back together, I'm going to give it a little squirt of lube, little rust prevention here, clean everything up before I put it back together. Probably need to clean that off a little bit more. And I'm going to throw a little wrap of electrical tape around the front of this. Alright, so before I put this back together, I'm going to take a little electrical tape, cut off all this nasty part here. Now this is the bottom of the bar, so what I like to do is start at the top, kind of in the middle. This is just my personal way of doing this. I wrap it around nice and tight. You don't want to do too much because you don't want it to interfere with the magnetism of this bar and the coils. So when I get to the top, I like to cut it off right at the edge there. That way you only get one strand of the tape on the bottom, and you have just enough tape to hold this in place to keep it from coming off on the top. And this will kind of quiet your machine down a little bit. It's the reason why I do this. It might eat a little bit of the vibration that's coming off of your armature bar when it smacks the front coil. Okay, so I'm gonna line these up so that my front spring lines up with my armature bar nipple. And I didn't roll this spring, I just bent it back here about a 20 degree, 15 degree angle, somewhere in there. Now, you can take your O-ring and slip it over your front spring, and you just want to pull it back over your screw and let it go. And then you don't want to mess with this. You don't want to pull this on and off, because just like you get the indentation in your armature bar, you'll get a little indentation here, and this spring will fit in here, and if you move it, it's going to throw it off. It's going to change how it's working. So once it's on there, you just kind of want to leave it alone. And you can either go on top here, which I found a short O-ring that just fit from here to here, or you can take your O-ring from here and place it around the back. I'm going to throw that back on there just to make sure that my measurements are correct. Okay, even though I'm not going to use one of these on my machine, I will show you how to make one. Now, you don't want to just cut the coin in half. If you look at your spring saddle or rear deck, you can see it's about that big. So you kind of want to adjust where you cut your coin so that it will fit and look nice on that spring saddle without having way too much hanging off there. I like to take off just the corner or an edge of the coin. Not in the middle, but just slightly off from the middle. And then you can't just drill in the middle of this coin, because if you look at your screw, it's offset. It's not in the center. So then you have to figure out where your hole is going to be, which for this coin and this machine, it's going to be right here. So you would drill that hole and then place that coin on there. Now, one of the problems that happens when you do this is these coins are not flat. You see you have a face or some kind of design on one side. So when you use these, they won't tighten down all the way. Once you get everything close and you need to tighten it up, you'll notice that you have to line up your coin with your spring saddle. So what I like to do is kind of put my thumb on the edge of this coin here when it's lined up before I tighten it down, because if you just tighten it down, it will go like that and it will turn on you, and then it will not line up with your rear deck. So put a finger on there, line everything up, and then tighten it down. You can see once it's tightened on there, you might be able to come in and still move your spring, and you move it around and it loosens up. And that's because of the grooves and the penny. It's not pushing down all the way on your spring. So if you do this, you really have to tighten down on this rear spring, make sure that's nice and tight. Or another option you have is just to take your file and file that down flat before you use it. That way it'll sit on there better and hold more of that spring, keep it from moving around. I have the bigger handle on my vise, put a coin on the back of this if I want this flat, or a flat washer. I've made my own springs, and I made it a 16 gauge spring to try out different gauge on there. I was thinking about going with some brass screws, but the problem is this. I use this attachment for most of the screws on this machine. I use this attachment and this Allen wrench to tighten these down. I use this attachment to tighten this down. Now, if I went to the store and bought some screws, probably gonna have like this, has a flat head on it, or it might have a Phillips head. And like I mentioned before, because these are pretty strong coils, I feel comfortable just leaving the steel screws, because I don't want to have to change out my tool every time I want to mess with one of the screws on here. So I'm just going to leave those steel, but what I'm going to do is take this little guy here, and I'm going to place it on top of my contact screw and show you guys how to do that. Because this is plastic, I can use a burner and burn a hole in this that I can stick this in. And this contact screw already has a flat head on it, so I'm going to use this attachment just to make a crease big enough to stick this in and super glue it into the underside of the skull here. Alright. So I'm going to keep doing this until this hole is big enough for this to fit in snugly. I don't want it too big, I just want it to go in there and fit nice and tight. I think I got this from a arts and crafts store. You can see there's already a hole in it. It's for beading or necklaces or something. If you wanted to use a round contact screw, you could probably just stick that in there and that'll work, and throw a little super glue on that. But I got plans for this one, and I'll show you what those are in a second. So use a drill, use whatever it takes just to get enough room to stick that end of the contact screw into your piece here. Okay, now once you have that, I'm going to take some super glue. Okay, take some super glue, place it inside your skeleton head or whatever you are using. Try not to get it on your fingers, and then place your contact screw in there, and you will have a contact screw. Make sure it's nice and straight with a skeleton accessory on top. Okay, so that's how you get your little plastic piece in there. Now you can do the same thing with the dice, but this dice isn't plastic, it's not going to burn as well. So I'm just going to use my Dremel tool again with a small bit. I'm going to drill this number 1 out just about that much, just so I can get the tip of this in there. That goes in there. I'm going to do the same process. Put a little super glue in there. Then add my contact glue. Here is the new look of this machine. So if you get tired machine looks and you want to switch it up a little bit, those are some ways that you can beautify your machine, personalize it a little bit more.